Nice to be back in London. It's been a year since David and I spoke together on stage. And it was here, this very stage, a year ago, actually.
Same room.
And since then, some stuff has happened. We've released new stuff, so we're going to talk to you today about ASP.NET Core 2.2. Anyone already running ASP.NET Core 2.2?
Are you crazy?
Excellent. Well done. That's actually most of the room. That's fantastic.
That's shocking.
All right, so let's get right into it. ASP.NET Core 2.2 was released in December. It's still only, 5 or 6 weeks old, along with .NET Core 2.2 and Entity Framework Core 2.2, obviously. They all kind of released together as one happy family these days. It is the latest release in our current train, and I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, because I think it's good and important to remind folks what the .NET Core support lifecycle it is, because it is quite different to the .NET Framework support lifecycle. We have already patched it once. We did a patch on Patch Tuesday this month. There was a security fix in 2.2.1, so please install that if you haven't already. And there will probably be another patch in February and another one in March. We tend to do patch fairly regularly .NET Core. People find issues, and then we fix them. That's how it works. You'll need Visual Studio 15.9 or Visual Studio for Mac 7.7, and if you're using VS Code, just the C# extension updates itself, and you'll be good. 2.1 is still the LTS release, so if you are looking for long-term support, don't use ASP.NET Core 2.2. If you're the type of customer who wants 3 years of solid support, stability, only critical bug fixes, and you're willing to pay Microsoft when you have an issue that you want investigated, then the LTS release is for you. So if we have a quick look at the download page, I want to highlight an error, okay, apparently. I want to highlight this new download page that was launched a few months ago. So this is the download page for the entire stream of 2.2 releases. Now, we have copped a bit of flack for our versioning in .NET Core, and it's probably a fair cop, fair enough. But versioning can be difficult when trying to version something as complicated as a large stack like .NET Core, which includes its own toolset and things like that as well. So let me just very quickly go over how the versioning works, and hopefully you'll walk away going, I get it now, or you'll walk away going, those guys are crazy, they have no idea what they're doing, why can't they just use names of kittens or something for the versions instead? So .NET Core 2.2 is the branding name. We'll see the major and the minor version whenever we talk about this and when it releases features and announcements and that type of thing, okay? And then this is a reverse chronological order every release we've done in this train, all the way back to the early previews. Okay, so you can see preview 1 and all the way through. Incidentally, the reason we call them previews now and not alphas and betas and gammas and deltas or whatever else is because you all can't agree on what should be in an alpha and what should be in a beta. And so whenever we try and call something a beta, we have these huge arguments online with folks who think a beta should mean one thing versus folks who think it should mean something else. And so we just kind of gave up and said, we'll just call them previews from now on. We'll tell you what's in them, and you can decide when you want to adopt that particular preview or not. But we do encourage you to adopt previews. We would love people to use previews more than they are right now, but I understand it's difficult. Not everyone can adopt preview stuff. They really need support sometimes, but it helps us when you use the previews because it's very hard to change stuff after it's gone into an RTM. So we've done a few previews. You can see a lot of information here, what data came out, where the release notes were, what versions of the languages it supported, whether it was included in a version of Visual Studio or not. Super important, not all .NET Core versions are actually inserted into Visual Studio. Some of them you have to go and download separately, okay? So that's useful to know. And also the version of the ASP.NET Core IIS module, which is the part of ASP.NET Core that you use to host it in IIS. And then obviously all the download links for the runtime and the SDK. So let's talk about the SDK versioning briefly. So there's the 2.2.0 release that we had in December. You'll note that the SDK version is a little bit different. So we've got a runtime version of 2.2.0, but the SDK is 2.2.100. So what happens here is this 2.2 is the branding version that we talked about, which matches the runtime version. They always will match. This is a whole versioning microcosm all to itself. And this represents what version the SDK is at for the 2.2 runtime. Okay? We tried some other versions. You might remember at one point the SDK flipped to match the VS version. It was like 15 something, and y'all freaked out, rightly, because that was a terrible idea. And then we kind of found our sanity and decided this was the best. We can't do pure Semver, right? This is as close to Semver as we're ever going to get, and it works pretty well for the runtime. It doesn't work very well for the SDK. There are so many components in here that version independently, that have their own versions, that we can't just encapsulate it all in a simple Semver version. So 100 means this is the first SDK release. Okay, that's all it means for this train. And then the next one, you'll note that we did an SDK release, but we didn't have a new runtime. So we had to patch the SDK. It's 101. And that could have been because of a bug in an MS build target, or a NuGet assembly had a new bug that we had to fix, or the compiler, or something like that, right? But we didn't have to change ASP.NET Core, didn't have to change .NET Core, it was just the SDK. And then after that, what did we do? I think we had another one of those. We had a 102, which this time we did have our 221. So that was a new runtime version. This one was a security patch. It tells you right there, which is kind of nice. And we had to obviously bump up the SDK version anytime the runtime version bumps. Okay? So 102. Now, incidentally, we'll also sometimes do versioning of the SDK that includes features. So if there was a new VS version that had a new NuGet feature, or a new language feature, or a compiler feature, I should say, then that might go to a 2, and then up to a 3, and up to a 4, even though .NET stays at 2.2. Okay, so that's how you decipher those things. And as I said, we do patch pretty much every month. There's usually a release every month, even after GA. And so you can see we've actually had 2 releases this month. We had an SDK 102 on the 8th of January, and we had a 103 on the 16th of January. But we haven't had one since then, so the last couple of weeks has been quiet. But we did ship a 3.0 preview this morning, I think, or yesterday. So there you go. Okay.
Is that clear now? Does
that help? Like that page,
sense?
by the way, just so you know, it can be a little hard to find. If you go to the main downloads page, which is where you land when you click download, you can ignore all this and go down to this one here, right? Where it says, can't find what you want, find more in .NET Core 2.2 downloads. And if you want to see all the things, you can go to the archives, which is the link underneath. And then here you can see this page for every version of .NET that we've ever done, right? So if I go to 2.1, which is the LTS release, like I talked about, the URL is hackable, right? .NET Core 2.1. I can put 2.2 in there, 3.0, 1.1, and I'll get the right download page. And then it's the same that I just explained. You can see the full history of the 2.1 LTS release and all the various details as to what happened on every release as we did that. So hopefully that will make it easier for you to find the right release. So let's go back to talking about 2.2 and ASP.NET in particular. What were the themes for this release? Well, we wanted to focus a lot on continuing the work we did in 2.1 to improve the story for people building HTTP APIs, or RESTful APIs, or web APIs, or whatever it is that you want to call them. You have an MVC controller, you take in some JSON usually, and you return some JSON. That's what I'm talking about. There's a lot of boilerplate code involved in doing that traditionally, and we're actively working incrementally to reduce the amount of boilerplate code that you need to write to build those types of APIs, and we'll have a look at that in a second. That includes better integration with popular open API solutions. Who here uses Swashbuckle? Right, it's about a third of the room. We did a little bit of look at some of our telemetry, and it looks like about half of our customers are using Swashbuckle on ASP.NET Core, which is amazing. A lot of people are using it. It's great. There's also NSWAG that's quite popular. Anyone using NSWAG? Yep, a few hands go. Not quite as popular, but there's a few people using that. So we got better integration with those stories. A bunch of performance improvements. It wouldn't be a .NET Core release if we didn't do something to improve the performance. We always try and do that. And then we took the chance to do a template refresher because our templates were a little bit old again, because that tends to happen. All right, so first thing that we've done to help API developers, the introduction of API controller analyzers and improvements to the API controller conventions that we introduced in 2.1. So what are the analyzers? Analyzers are a feature of the Roslyn compiler and toolchain that allow you to inspect code at design time in the editor and at build time, and then either offer you suggestions on how to fix it, or just straight up result in build warnings or errors even if you find something that you shouldn't be doing. And these analyzers are designed to help you document your APIs properly so that your Swagger tools can then go up and describe what your APIs do in as much detail as possible. It'll also help you remove boilerplate code, where we've now taken the liberty to do things for you on your behalf in the framework. There's also an extensible set of conventions that work in conjunction with those analyzers that help encapsulate really common API controller patterns. And so if you've ever looked at your API controllers and you go, wow, I seem to be writing these 6 lines of code over and over and over and over and over again, or I always have these 4 or 5 attributes on the top of my API action methods, you can now encapsulate those things in a single class and tell MVC, hey, I just want you to apply these conventions everywhere you see this pattern. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. These are applicable to the controllers marked with the API controller attribute, which was introduced in 2.1. So you can just take any controller class, you can decorate it with API controller, and then it changes how that controller will be treated by MVC and by the tooling. And as I said, we're really trying to reduce boilerplate code when doing that. Secondly, we introduced support for problem details, which is an implementation of RFC 7807. Well, what's that? It's designed to provide machine-readable details of errors that occur when you call an HTTP API. Who's ever built their own sort of error schema so that if their APIs fail, they return a JSON object with the right? Yeah. So if you literally read this RFC, it says, we want to make it so you don't have to build your own error type. Let's just all use this one. That's basically the summary of the first paragraph, okay? So we looked at that, we said, that sounds like a great idea, and we've implemented that as the default return type for 400 style errors in MVC if you're using an API controller. And that's an example of that return type there. So you can see it's got a list of errors, which gives you a name of what the error is, tells you what the description was for that error, tells you a title of the overall error response, gets a status, and then you get a trace ID. Now, ASPNET Core already has built-in request identifiers that are always emitted out to the logging system or the error pages when you have an error. So we've just taken that same trace identifier and shoved it out through here as well. And if you don't like that format, you can always override it. That's very simple to do in middleware. You can just stamp on your own identifier onto the request and it'll get honored. So let's have a look at what this looks like. And I'm going to crouch down behind the lectern because it's a little hard to use Visual Studio when I'm standing up like this. Okay, so let's have a look. I've got a few different controllers over here. Actually, I've got 2 different controllers. I've got a customers controller and a widgets controller, and they're from different eras. So my widgets controller looks like controllers that some of you might have today. Let me zoom that up a little bit for you. Okay, so this is an example of a controller using the idioms that were in ASP.NET Core 2. Okay, well, before 2.1 and before 2.2. And, you know, they return iAction result, which is pretty normal, or they return an object type directly, okay, the web API style, depending on the type of API. They're using attribute routing because attribute routing is superior in every way to the other routing. And I want them to be well documented, so I have to go through and live through this attribute soup so that things that are looking at the return types, looking at the method signatures, understand what these actually do. Because if you look at getWidget, yeah, I know it takes an ID, okay, fair enough, but it just returns iAction result. If I look at that signature, I can't possibly know what actual things you return. Do you return 404s? Do you return 200s? Do you return 203s? I don't know, because it's just an iAction result. So you have to go in and tell the system, well, yeah, I do produce a response type. It returns some payload that'll look like a widget, and that will happen when I return a 200, okay? And so anyone who's ever used Swashbuckle or NSwag to build OpenAPI or Swagger endpoints typically ends up doing this type of thing. Now, there's a really bad problem with this style of coding, though, which is that it's really difficult to keep this up to date. It's like code comments, but they're a lot more important than code comments, right? These are actually describing your API, and if you're relying on a Swagger endpoint to help the consumers of your API ensure that they're doing the right thing, you can come in here and make a code change and return something else, and now your doc is out of date, and nothing in the system will tell you that. Okay, so that's one of the things that we wanted to try and improve. Now, let's have a quick look at this before I jump over to the new controller, and we'll have a look at what the Swagger endpoint looks like. So here's my Swagger endpoint. I'm using Swashbuckle for ASP.NET Core in this case, and I get the standard Swagger UI as a result of that. And here's my widgets endpoint, right? And so I can go in and I can see, because I've added all those attributes, it does tell me, yes, this is going to return a 200, which it does assume, but it actually has model details because I told it that it returns a 200 with a widget, right? So this is the benefit of doing that. If I go to my post, I can come down here and it says, well, you might get a 201, meaning that you created that, and here's, I'll return you the thing that was created. Or you might get a 400 bad request, and it will return, if I click on model here, you can see that it's returning problem details, okay? Because I told it. I actually went in there and did the work as the developer to describe all this stuff. So it looks wonderful, it's just a lot of work to do so. So how can we make that a little bit better? So I'm going to go over to my customers controller, which is slightly newer. So now I'm using some of the idioms that we introduced in 2.1. So I have action result of T, which isn't new in 2.2. We did that in 2.1, and I hope a lot of you have started using it. And as you can see, the biggest change there is that, well, now not only do I have the return type describing it as an action result, which we need for MVC and C# and that stuff, but more importantly, I have a T. I know what type of content you're going to return as well. An action result is a little bit clever in that it can implicitly cast or convert between the T or the iAction result. It is both at the same time. Okay, so you can have methods that return either the T or something that's an action result. That's really the trick of action result of T. Okay, so then we can start layering stuff on top of this to make it a little bit more productive for me. So I'm going to go over, just going to quickly show you my CS proj. So in here I've added a few packages, but the one that's interesting is this one here. This is new in 2.2. Microsoft ASPNET call.mvc.api.analyzers. And these are those Roslyn analyzers that are going to help me in ensuring that my APIs are well documented. So let's go back. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my controller, and I'm going to uncomment in API controller. I'm going to turn this back into an API controller, because I commented that out because I wanted to see what this looked like without the analyzers. Okay? Actually, let me make sure I've reset this properly. No, I have. That's good. All right. So if I scroll down, you can start seeing some green squiggles now. So it's saying, hey, action method returns an undeclared status code. And if I click on that, it says you are returning things that aren't the T. Like, I don't know what type of status codes you're going to return until I inspect the code. But that's what analyzers can do. They can look beyond the signature. They can look inside the code. And so then it offers to fix it for me. And so now it's decorated that method with all the correct stuff for me. So that's one step better than what we had before. I didn't have to do it manually, and the analyzer told me when I got it wrong. If I go off and I delete one of those, right, the analyzer should come back. Ryan, should come back. Ryan, developer is in the front row. And no, it's making a liar of me, but that's okay. What's that? Oh, because I've got this one. Let me return that one. So default's kind of a catch-all. So you have to remove that one before it'll tell you. There you go. And so now it's telling me, hey, you're not doing not found. Okay. Now, as I said, that's one step better. At least I can work through now and I can ensure it's correct. But I still have to do it everywhere. And this is incredibly repetitive, right? I often have the pattern of an action method called getSomething that takes an ID of some type and returns an action result of T. Like, that's really common. And when I do that, I almost always end up either returning a not found, returning the actual T, and maybe one or two other things. So why do I have to put these attributes everywhere? Well, you don't, thanks to conventions. So rather than decorating every single set of things, what I can do, this is all yelling at me now because I've got my analyzers on, I can go over to my startup, and I will apply to the entire assembly a set of default conventions. So API convention type of default API conventions. These ship in the box in MVC. Okay, that's why they're the default ones. And if I have 12 on that to look at it, what it looks like is it's a static class that we use to basically declare what the shape of my APIs looks like. Okay? And then we use all these declarative attributes to kind of modify the system and tell it what we expect it to look like. So if I go down and look at create, for example, and I expand that to get the attributes, here are those attributes. We've just moved them into a central location. And then we effectively do pattern matching, right? We match the signature of this method here on line 15 with any action method that we discover. And if they match, then we apply all the attributes that you've got here. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, this is the one that's in the box, but you can make your own. You can say, I don't like these conventions. I have my own convention. Create your own type, decorate it, register it, and then you've got those conventions everywhere. So now that I've applied those, if I go back to my customer controller, I don't have the warning anymore because the analyzer is aware of what conventions are being applied. All right, so now it's just fine. I don't have any of that boilerplate code. I can just write the code I care about, and it's going to do the right thing all the way through. Okay? So now, if I go back to my Swagger endpoint, wake up. There we go. Go back over here, and we'll look at my customer's endpoint now. I get all the same type of richness that I got with the widgets endpoint, but I didn't have any of those attributes in my code. So here's my my post, sorry. It says it's going to accept a model which looks like the customer model because that's what it was declared as, and it says it might return a 201, it might return a 400, and that's the problem details again. And so all of these APIs are well documented. They all tell you what you expect and what's going to get returned, and the system is fully extensible so you can make it do what you like. Very nice. Oh, that's the wrong one. Where is my presentation? It's gone. Okay. All right, so endpoint routing. An entirely new routing system. How many times have we rewritten the routing system so far?
3.
Is this the third?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we've probably got a couple of prototypes we never shipped as well.
4.
This one is the best one. And
it's the last time. It's the last time.
Because it's the latest one. So we have grand plans for endpoint routing. At one point, we called it global routing. I think we might have even called it super happy routing at one point. But it's endpoint routing is the name that we've settled on. It is entirely new, and right now is only used by MVC. But in 3.0, this is going to be opened up to be useful to any middleware or to any type of system that wants to say, hey, I have some endpoints, declare endpoints for the application. It also was an opportunity for us, because it's a new routing system, to fix some of the quirks that we had introduced with attribute routing. Convention-based routing and attribute routing, 2 routing systems in MVC, had slight differentiations in the way they worked sometimes, which did trip some people up. There were some particular behaviors that when we introduced razor pages, I know bothered me, and we took the opportunity in here to fix some of those behaviors, which is good. It is designed for future use outside of MVC, like I said, but it is only in MVC in 2.2. So why is it different? So routes are now evaluated earlier in the request pipeline with endpoint routing, wherever the endpoint routing middleware is placed, and they can also include metadata. Okay, so rather than the routing matching being run and then the handler being executed, the matching is run and it says, hey, this is the endpoint I'm going to hit later on in the request pipeline. And here's a bunch of metadata about that endpoint that you might be interested in. For example, this endpoint has an authorization policy, or this endpoint has a cause policy. Okay? And that can get stamped on to the currently declared endpoint for the current request, and then the request continues. And then another piece of middleware can come along and go, oh, I see that the endpoint is set to David's great API, and it says that this requires a JOT token that has this policy inside of it. And I'm the JOT token middleware, so let me check that for you. Okay?
The issue we have was that in previous versions of ASPNET Core, there was middleware and filters that did the same thing. And the whole point of this thing is to do routing early enough that middleware can actually look at the result of routing and make choices. So cores is now one middleware instead of being a middleware and being a filter. Same for auth-Z, same for auth-N, right?
Right, and we had multiple subsystems that wanted to support the same cross-cutting concerns. We had Signaler, and we had MVC, and there are probably other ones, and you want to authorize hubs as well as MVC controllers, or you want cores to apply to Signaler and to MVC. And in the past, we effectively meant we had to share that logic or re-implement it across 2 different systems.
Right.
We weren't getting the benefit of the middleware system. Endpoint routing helps us solve that. And so middleware running afterwards, as I said, can inspect whatever the endpoint was selected. It can even set a new endpoint if it wants to, because it hasn't run yet. The endpoint doesn't run until the end. That's why it's called an endpoint.
Right.
And if you get to the end of the pipeline after all the middleware have run, because no one has short circuit, then that endpoint is executed, a little bit like a handler in the old world, and then all the middleware get to run on the response on the way out. Okay? So, as I said, the benefit that we have now in MVC is that we got to write it for MVC and give it to you in 2.2, but it helped drastically improve the performance of a real benchmark, not a routing micro benchmark, but a full application handling requests. The plain text MVC test, as you can see over here, when we checked in the endpoint routing implementation, jumped by almost 20%. Okay, so that's a really measurable improvement in the routing system because we rewrote it again and made it better. Okay, super, super nice. Other performance improvements, up to a 20% improvement in the model validation system for some common scenarios. So previously in MVC, when you send a request and there was really nothing to validate, we still ran a bunch of code anyway, all right, assuming that there was. And we've now basically optimized that for certain scenarios where, oh, well, we don't need to do anything, let's just shortcut that. And that saves a lot of time for very common requests. The other thing that we did was work on HTTP client. So if you're doing any type of distributed or microservice-y style stuff where you've got one app that talks to another app via HTTP client, massive improvements there for you, especially on Linux. David tells me that,
that's huge.
That this improvement was caused by removing a lock.
A lock, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So never let it be said that even the folks at Microsoft don't find low-hanging fruit that can get you twice the throughput.
A lock or a sleep, I'm not sure.
Was it a sleep?
No, it's not sleep.
Okay.
It wasn't a sleep. It definitely wasn't a sleep.
It's called the future employment continuity. You need to leave yourself space to improve in future versions.
Yeah.
So on Windows, we've got a
security.
20% improvement, and on Linux, we've got a 60% improvement, which is great to see. These are not to the same scale for the eagle-eyed. They might be, oh, look, they're the same now. No, this one says 80,000, this one says 100,000. So the Windows implementation is still a little bit faster,
for now.
25% faster for now. We're still working on it, though. Okay, link generator. So who's used URL helper? That's a trick question. You've all used URL helper because it's the only way to generate URLs in MVC. The problem with URL helper is you need an HTTP context to use URL helper. So if you're not in a request, you can't generate a URL to another part of your application. Of course, the other problem is that it only works with routing that was configured for MVC. So if you wanted to get a URL for a signaler hub, it doesn't help you, right? Or a URL for a static file, it doesn't help you. Link generator is a new API that's been introduced in 2.2 that works in conjunction with endpoint routing. So anything that declares itself as having endpoints and feeds into the endpoint routing system, you can generate links for with the link generator. Okay, now in 2.2, limited to MVC, as we said before, but in 3.0 this will open up so that anything that reports itself as an endpoint, you'll be able to generate a link for using link generator. You can do that in middleware because you don't, you have a context there, but you're outside of MVC. So URL helper, not only did you need HTTP context, I think you needed some MVC stuff too, right? So now you can be in a random object that you activate via dependency injection outside of the scope of a request. You may be doing background email generation and you need to generate a link, right? Now you'll be able to do that. People do horrible tricks today to make this work. They capture an HTTP context, they store it over here, then they pull it out. People are smiling in the front row. And they go, yeah, don't do that. But you have to today to generate those URLs. Link generator is a new API designed to solve those problems. Okay, the last one that was new for routing as part of the wonderful endpoint routing is route parameter transformers. It basically allows you to write a simple piece of code by plugging it into a new interface so you can customize routes by transforming the values of those routes. And they get evaluated once when the route table is built at the beginning of the application. And so the canonical example we use is this sluggification. So you may have seen things like my article might be the name of the controller, which is a little silly example, but let's say it's the name of your controller. But you really want the URL to be sluggified, my-article. Doing that in routing today is a little bit difficult, to say the least. You typically would end up having to run code on every request and transform things on the fly while you look up a database and all that type of thing. If you just have patterns that you want to apply globally, you can write something as simple as this. It'll get evaluated once, and then we store that transform inside the table, and then we apply it both for incoming evaluation to figure out where it's going, and also for link generation on the way out, because that's the power of the routing system.
Regex. Regex.
I know, I saw regex and cried a little bit, but then Ryan said, don't worry, it's only evaluated once, it's perfectly fine. And I said, okay, it's totally, you could rewrite that not using regex if it really did bother you. All right. So that was the end of endpoint routing. Let's move on to the next thing, which is health checks. Health checks is a very common concern inside applications that are hosted in production, that have lots of dependencies, where you want to ensure that the application can report its status and potentially have an orchestrator of some type either not send traffic to that application or to reboot it if something is wrong automatically. Okay? So the health checks API is now in ASPNET Core to help you with that problem. Health checks can pass or fail. It's pretty straightforward. But the pass or the failure can be mapped to one of three states. Your health check can say your application is healthy. It can say the application has in a degraded state, which means whatever it means for that application. Or it can say that the application is unhealthy. That's really important because that plugs into the idea of both liveness and readiness checks. And if you've ever used something like Kubernetes, this will be all too obvious to you. You want to understand that your application is alive, meaning it's not dead. It is alive and it's running well. Give me traffic, all right? But then there's readiness, which is, I'm okay, but just don't send me traffic right now. You don't need to reboot me, all right? But just don't give me traffic right now. And that's useful if the application is starting up and priming its caches, or maybe it's gone through a burst of load and it just likes you to back off for a moment while it catches up. That's the readiness check. Liveness is like, I can't talk to my database, my hard drive is full, I've got a Stack Overflow or something. The process would have crashed by then. But something else, okay? And then you're basically indicating to someone, I'm done, right? I'm over. You need to come and reboot me, all right? We've included a simple middleware that lets you expose the health status of your application so that you can get to it via URL. And you can put that URL on a different host if you don't want to expose it externally. You can put it on a different port if you want to as well, et cetera, et cetera. You could put... It's kind of hard to put authorization in front of it at the moment because that's coming in 3.0 with endpoint routing.
Yep.
But you can do it on a different port for now. And then we've worked with the authors of the BeatPulse library. Anyone using BeatPulse today for their health status at all? No? Okay, one. Okay.
One.
Anyone else heard of BeatPulse? Yep, okay. So rather than us shipping a whole bunch of health checks in the system, we just worked with the BeatPulse team. Well, actually, they did most of the work. And they ported all of their wonderful health checks to work with our health check system. So rather than having to use our stuff, you can go use all their wonderful stuff for common dependencies. All right, so let's have a look at health checks in action. So this application I had over here, I have health checks set up. If I go to my startup file, scroll down, you can see me adding health checks over here into my startup class. Now I've got 2 health checks registered with this system. I have a pre-canned health check, which I got from BeatPulse. So the disk storage health check, as it sounds like, checks if you've got enough disk space left. And in this case, I'm just adding my C drive, because that's the only one I have, and I'm making sure I have 32 gigabytes free in order to say that I'm healthy. The second health check I'm adding is an inline custom check, and I've called it ping bing. And all it does is ping bing, as you can tell. But I've gone a little bit further, and I've shown how you can do the 3 different statuses. So I've sent a ping and told it to time out if it takes more than 5 seconds. And if it does time out, meaning that the IP status result will not be successful, then I say, hey, if it's anything other than success, my app is unhealthy. It's taking more than 5 seconds to get to Bing, something's wrong. But if it was successful, then I go down to a little more granularity. If it was under 200 milliseconds, I say, hey, I'm healthy. If it was anything between 200 and 5,000, which indicates success, then I'm going to report myself as degraded. And then I have an endpoint configured down here, app.useHealthChecks in my middleware pipeline. I put the URL at healthchecks API, and then I've passed in an option that rewrites the response so that it's written out in JSON. By default, our inbox health check endpoint just writes out the word healthy, unhealthy, or degraded. And that's it. You get no more detail, right? If you want more detail, like which health check failed, how long did it take, was there any other metadata with that health check, then you can just plug in your own response writer, right? It's just a delegate, it takes all the data, and then you can write out whatever you like to the stream. So I've used a pre-canned one, comes from BeatPulse, and that means it'll write out as JSON. So let's go and have a look at that. I'm going to go back to my application here, and I've got a little link to my health check, right? So here it is. It says that my application is currently overall in a healthy state, and that's because I have 2 health checks running. One of them is my disk space health check, which is saying it's healthy, and the other one is my Bing health check, which says it's healthy. Now, if I hit F5 a lot, maybe I can get Bing to be slow. And this will burn 5 minutes, I told David, so we don't have to worry about... No, it's all right. So let me go and change it, and we'll force it to be unhealthy by making it a ridiculous sort of... Well, let's say that it has to take less than 10 milliseconds because I need to frag lots of people or something. Is that what people say? They still say frag? Okay. Now I'm going to hit F5. And, see, now it says it's degraded. So it took less than 5 seconds, so I haven't marked it unhealthy. Oh, I got a healthy. Look at that. Bing replied in less than, what did I say, 20 milliseconds?
10.
10, and there, but here it's degraded again. So you can see how you can build health checks that are quite sensitive to what's going on in the system. Now, the Beat Pulse one that I added is the system health check package, and it includes like GC and CPU time and a bunch of other sort of system-y level stuff. So you can like say, oh, my app is unhealthy because it's like working bytes and allocated bytes. Yep. And then they have health checks for Redis and SQL Server and all that type of stuff.
Azure Storage.
What was that one?
Redis,
yeah.
Azure Storage.
Azure Blobs,
Azure
all
Blobs,
types of
SQL,
stuff.
the whole thing.
The only other health check that we ship in the box is one for Entity Framework. So if you have a DB context that's registered and you would like to just have a health check that checks the DB context can connect to the database, maybe run a test query, you can add that one. That one is in the box. Because we own Entity Framework, so we decided to do that one. All right, pretty cool. Alrighty. Anyone else? Is anyone actually using Kubernetes or any type of orchestration system today and they've built their own endpoint for this type of stuff?
Have your own health set? Yeah.
Anyone hosting in Azure? Anyone? Okay. So have you used the alerting system? So you can configure an alert in Azure. I'm assuming AWS has the same thing. And you can say, hey, I want you to run this alert every 30 minutes. Go and ping whatever this endpoint is in my application. And then you can have it like parse the output and look for a certain keyword and stuff like that. And if it's unhealthy, send me an alert, take it out, rotate Azure Traffic Manager somewhere else or anything. This is perfect for that as well. Okay. All right. Oh, one of my favorite features. After we said that we wouldn't do it back in ASP.NET Core 1 Beta 7. All right, ANCM, ASP.NET Core Module IS in-process hosting. So ASP.NET Core Module is the IS module that hosts ASP.NET Core in IS. Pretty self-explanatory. We have added support in 2.2 that lets you do that in the IS worker process. W3WP or IS Express if you're running in Visual Studio. Previously, what would happen is that ANCM would go, oh, you want to run an ASP.NET application that's running on .NET Core. It would boot .NET EXE for you on the first request, and then it would proxy, literally proxy, every request across to that process, wait for the response, and then send it back. That has some implications, the big one being performance, startup time and performance. But now we have the ability for you to host that inside W3WP. And so ANCM can now boot .NET Core directly inside that process, sometimes next to .NET Framework, so you've got both of them running if you need to. And then ASP.NET Core will run there. There are a couple of caveats. You can only do this with ASP.NET Core applications that are targeting .NET Core. So if your ASP.NET Core application is still running on .NET Framework, this is not for you. It is also limited to a single app per application pool. Now, that has been the guidance from the IIS team for a few years now for security reasons, but there are still legitimate cases where you might want to put more than one application in a single app pool if they're both within the same trust boundary, but you cannot do that with this in-process hosting. There's a very good reason. What's the reason?
Doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
There's no app domain support in .NET Core yet.
No app domains, and you can only load the CLR once. And so you can't have like two core CLRs running in the process with two different applications. So if this app wants core CLR 2.1 and this one was 2.2,
can't do it.
Right? So you just can't do it. What are the benefits? 4 times, up to 4 times throughput performance. Crazy. And up to 4 times startup performance. So here's an example of the throughput performance. This is from our benchmark suite. The orange line, or the first one here, is showing our JSON test. So hitting an endpoint that's returning JSON on Windows in process. And this one above it is our plain text test, which obviously doesn't do JSON encoding. These two are in process. These two down here are out of process. So 2.1 to 2.2. All right, massive, massive, massive performance improvement. Fantastic stuff. Let me show you what it does for you when you're just working in Visual Studio though. So this application is set up to use in process currently because it's the default in 2.2. So if you create a new 2.2 application, this property is in the template, and this instructs ANCM to run in process. And so if I run I've already running this application, right? And so if I go and find Process Explorer, which I'm pretty sure I have in my downloads folder, Proc Explorer, there it is. From the wonderful sysinternals suite of tools, I can clumsily try and find the IS Express process. There it is. So IS Express is down here, and you'll note, well, that's it. There's no .NET .exe running under IS Express, right? It's just IS Express. My application is running in there. How do I know it's running? Well, it's using 100 meg, so I'm going to assume that's because my app's in it.
Look at DLLs.
Look at the DLLs. This is where this demo went off the track last time. But I will do it because you want me to.
Yeah.
I spent 10 minutes trying to find the tab that shows the modules that are loaded.
Prove it works.
Right? So if I go to IS Express, oh, here they all are. They're right here. Look, I have it up from last time. Here are all the .NET DLLs, right? So there's some native DLLs. Let's go and find the .NET ones. Oh, there we go. So here we go. These are all the ASPNET core DLLs running directly inside IS Express. Somewhere in there will be my application. Web application 43, 44. There it is. And even my views. Okay, so we've got everything running in a single process. Let's go and change this to out of process. Okay, and I'll rebuild. And then I will launch again. Is it building? Did it build? I'll just hit launch. It'll do the right thing, right?
Yes.
There we go. So there it is. I reckon that took longer. It looked like it took longer.
Yeah.
We'll compare them in a moment.
It's like 5
and
seconds.
then we'll go back to Proc Explorer. And now I see an IS Express down here, which is probably the wrong one. So we'll see if we can find, so it's under, oh, we've got IS Express, I've got to find .NET. Oh, I'm not looking at the tree view version. I need to.
Oh, it's flat. I was wondering.
Yeah, I need to look at the unflattened version.
So before you lied then.
Show process tree.
So you may have lied before then.
So here's .NET, I was lying before. No, we showed the modules. So here's .NET .exe, which was spawned by MS Builds. That's the wrong one. Here's IS Express. And here's .NET .exe, which was spawned by VS launcher.exe, right? So you can see there's a lot more layers going on when we're doing out of proc. So IS Express is using a lot less memory here because all the memory is being loaded into .NET .exe down here instead. That's where my application is actually running, okay? So that's fine, it's different. There's different processes, yeah, I get it. Well, what's super interesting is more the time it takes. So let's turn on the network tab, and I'm just going to filter this down to just show documents, okay? And it's saying that when I hit F5, it took 16 milliseconds because I didn't change anything. Like it's hot. So let's go and change something in the application, something super critical, like I'll add a comment here. Very good. And then I'll rebuild it, right? So I've rebuilt it, but the app hasn't booted yet because the way the rebuild cycle works is that VS detected I rebuilt. It kept IS Express running here, but it won't boot .NET .exe until a request comes in, right? So if I hit F5, we get to see how long it takes for the app to start up. That was pretty quick, actually. 1.24 seconds. That's not too bad. Oh, good. Let's do it again.
Make it out of sleep.
No, let's not do that.
Make it slower.
So I build it there, go over here, hit F5. 1.5 seconds. That's pretty consistent. Okay. Let's go back and change it to in process. Okay. We'll build that. Okay, now I've changed it, so in theory, this will be first request, and that's 1.1.
It's much faster.
It was a little bit faster. It was a little bit faster.
Yeah.
Let's change it again. We'll save that. Compile it. It built. Come over here, hit F5.
No collapse?
It's actually the exact same. So I didn't I don't trust that works. I don't trust that works. Because when I tested that yesterday, it was 800 milliseconds versus 3.
I saw it. I saw it.
So you saw it. Anyway. I have a slide that proves that it's correct because I took a picture. So, oh, not there, I don't. I thought I did. So we do have a, I think I brought it up in the browser, actually. If you go to, I thought I had that one up. If you go to our benchmarks portal, and I go and look at the custom benchmarks, we actually run both in process and out of process regularly. So if I switch over to Windows and I choose IS in proc and IS out of proc and I turn off Kestrel sockets, so you can see the performance difference there. Obviously, the one that's much higher is the one that is the one that's faster. And if I go to our KPIs, is the in proc, I should say. If I go to our KPIs and choose that, we have a KPI that tracks time to first response. And so, oh, that's right. I showed this as part of
why is that red? Okay. Good.
Yeah. So just to give you a sneak peek of the type of things that are coming in 3.0 and the difference between startup performance when we make some small changes in the framework or in the tool chain, these two boxes up here are interesting. This one is showing 3.0 versus 2.2 with a new feature called tiered compilation. This one, this one underneath it, so that's this number here, 3,000,057 is 2.2 with tiered compilation enabled, right? This one down here, 2.2, is 2.2 without tiered compilation enabled. And you can see the difference is at 2.8. So we've got a really healthy throughput boost by enabling this new feature in 2.2 called tiered compilation. When it comes to startup performance, if I go down here, this is the startup performance difference between 3.0 and 2.2. And this is measuring the time to the very first response. Start the application, you get that first response back. In 3.0, this test, it takes 302 milliseconds. In 2.2, it takes 648 milliseconds. Okay, so we've almost doubled. We have doubled, actually, more than doubled the time to first response in 3.0, which is cool. All right, other changes. HTTP2 preview support in Kestrel. We encourage you to try it out. It is on by default. In fact, if I go back to the browser and I go back to my app and we look at the network tab, you'll note this is H2, but of course that's a lie because I'm using IS Express, which already supports HTTP2. But if I was to run this as Kestrel, you would see the same thing. You can try it yourself. It does work. But it is not certified for edge readiness yet, and so it is not turned on by default. You have to turn it on. 3.0, we're going to make that edge ready. Okay. We've updated the templates to Bootstrap 4 and Angular 6 if you're doing SPA. You saw the Bootstrap 4 template. It's quite a bit simpler than the old template. I kind of like it. We have a new thing in Signaler, which you have a demo for, so we'll do that in just a second, which is improved Signaler client disconnect. One of the really hard things about Signaler is offering you a nice programmable event when clients go away. Because networking just lies. It just flat out lies about whether someone is there or not, because it's designed to mask those things because clients tend to come and go. And they still want to get the packets that they had on the logical connection. And so we've added some things that make that a little bit more reliable for you. Signaler now has a Java client for Android development. It's available in Maven. And we improved our JavaScript client so that you can use it from Node.js natively. And then lastly, as I mentioned, tiered compilation is now available as an option. It is off by default. So to enable it, you have to go into your project.
Why is it off by default, Damian?
That's a very good question.
If it's better, is it better?
So, as is the case with many new and advanced new and advanced things, we would like them to be perfect the day that we release them. Things that are this low in the stack, though, we have to be very careful. Changing how we compile your code in the process that the code is running, when we take it from IL and we turn it into machine code, was something we don't take lightly. Who remembers when we released RyuJIT, the new jitter for .NET Framework, the 64-bit jitter, 4 years ago? And we broke Stack Overflow. That was because it's really, really, really hard to fully test something like that. And so we didn't find that issue until the Stack Overflow folks ran it through their stuff. And so for tiered compilation, what we did is we turned it on in the 2.2 previews. Please, please, please use the previews. Turned it on in the previews to try and get some coverage and get feedback. And then we turned it off in 2.2 RTM and said, hey, we'll support you if you turn it on, but we're not going to turn it on for every application by default. Okay? Because we did discover some application workloads that got slower with tiered comp rather than getting faster. And we don't want it to be the default until we're fairly confident that nearly every application will just be better with tiered compilation. So, the short story is, I encourage you to turn it on. Go into your project, change tiered compilation to true, and bask in the wonder that is better throughput times and better startup times. But then just be vigilant. Just make sure that if you see something weird, you go, that's right, I turned on that feature.
Turn it off.
Turn it off and see if the weirdness goes away. Yeah. And if it does, log a bug on the core CLR repo, and then we can make it better for everyone in 3.0. Okay? All right. And there was those things I just showed you. All right, coming soon after that. Let's do a demo, though, first. Let's do your demo.
Okay.
So let's do the incredibly risky unplug one laptop.
Switch.
Shuffle over here.
Switch.
Oh my God.
No. All right,
MagSafe. Oh, not MagSafe. What's this one called? Surface Mag. Surface Safe.
Windows Surface laptop thing.
Right, there you go.
Is it on?
So we're going to do a demo of Signaler client disconnection detection improvement.
So imagine you're in a car coding Signaler. and you went through a tunnel. In Sigma 2.1, and even the old version in .NET Framework, it would take a long time, and sometimes up to an hour, for the network to decide that it was offline.
An hour?
It could be an hour, depending
I could close my laptop
on how you go offline.
Think I was there for an hour?
There's graceful and ungraceful disconnect.
Okay.
If you're graceful, that means the browser sends a closed frame from the browser to the server side and says, like, I'm gone, client.
Okay.
If you go offline via tunnel or via closing the laptop or just ungracefully, it can take sometimes, not forever, but it can take a super long time to observe the actual disconnect.
Can we say disgracefully instead?
Disgracefully, yeah.
Disgraceful
and ungraceful sounds nicer. Okay, so I have a super simple app here. Let me show you the code first before I get started. I have my awesome code that just boots up a connection to the chat endpoint because everything is chat. Then I call start. And I have a button that just stops the JavaScript in the debugger, and we'll talk about why I'm doing that as my fake offline. On the server side, I have a regular hub that just has breakpoints in on-connected and on disconnect async.
Okay, so you've got events that are handling new client connects.
New client, and new client goes offline.
Client disconnects.
Yep.
And what you're saying is that sometimes this event just wouldn't fire for an hour after the person is gone.
So we got tons of bugs in 2.1 where people said, I went offline with a cell phone, went through a tunnel or something, and it wouldn't ever fire.
Okay.
And we went, huh? That's weird. Turns out that's normal.
That is normal in networking.
So in Siglar, we have a server-to-client ping, so that if the server, there's two ways. So if the client goes away, you could tell on the server side that the client went away. And the same for the client. If the server goes away, the client has to know. So we send pings now in both directions.
Who initiates the ping?
Server.
So the server pings the client, and the client
pings
responds.
the server, yeah.
Okay.
All right, so I hit F5, and the client joined, so it fired the first event.
Okay.
I'll connect async, and now it's running. And then the browser, let me close this one thing. Okay, that thing went offline. So if you close the browser, it's graceful. Okay. It sends a close message to the server, and it goes offline.
So we're in the breakpoint now for disconnecting. Okay.
Yeah. So that ran fine. Let me refresh again.
So now we need to act disgracefully.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now I'm online. Client is there. Now I'm going to just pause for a little bit. I'm just going to go through a tunnel in the car.
Okay.
And stop.
So you're simulating a bad network right now.
Yep. It's gone offline. And the server is like, I can't get client pings. Right?
How long does this
At some
take?
point,
How long does this
VS
take?
will steal focus.
How long does that take?
And it will hit a breakpoint. And the demo won't fail because it just worked. Because it just worked.
How long do the pings usually, like, what's their frequency?
It's configurable. By default, it's 30 seconds.
Did you change the default?
I think so.
I mean, 30 seconds. I'm assuming we don't wait exactly for 30.
5
we
seconds.
Like do a bit after 30.
There's like a plus minus 5
minus
seconds,
something?
maybe.
Oh, you set it to 5 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it should fire. So
At
it
some
should
point.
fire. So it does fire normally. So it should fire.
Has anyone ever tried to test network stuff like this? It is horrendously difficult.
It would have been better if I was not a local host and it wasn't fake.
You still debugging?
But it basically works. I mean, it kind of works. If you pretend there was a breakpoint that was hit and understand the sync, it's basically the same thing.
Basically the same thing?
Okay, hold on. Let's start. Let me hit F5 again.
Make sure that...
Oh, look. Wait.
That doesn't look like it worked.
I hit F5, network tab,
okay.
chat.
All right, let's watch the
Let's wait for the first ping pong.
That's a fair point. It's building tension. There it is. All right, there's a ping.
That's okay. So
a ping pong.
This arrow is crap.
Up, down.
This way. Oh no. Whoa. Did I hit a 5? Let's try one more time. Am I still online?
Don't worry, you haven't lost anyone.
Hold on.
There's going to be another ping?
If not, I may have gone. Oh, okay.
Okay. So you connect.
One more time. Last time.
All right.
Last time.
Third time's the
charm. So here's the ping pong. No hands.
We got lots of bugs about this.
No
right?
hands.
Okay.
It's fixed for sure.
Here it goes. 1.
Okay.
That's up and down.
There's a ping pong.
That looks like the client sent the ping to the server.
Yeah. So sorry.
Oh. And then it disconnected.
Go offline. So it's working.
Is 5 seconds too short?
It might be too short.
It might be too short. I think
So you can configure that interval to something reasonable.
then it works. So
to make it work
what I
properly.
got out of this demo was don't set the client ping interval to 5 seconds. Don't set
The
it to
default
anything
is
less than
fine. The default is fine.
Okay. I hope that it's clear what this is meant to do.
I'll try it one more time.
I actually think it's because it's too short, and it's mucking up the...
Turn on offline mode in
Yes, so this gentleman is suggesting, why don't you try offline mode?
That didn't work. We tried
every
that.
offline flag and mode and Bitcoin mining extension that we could find.
I even got a sketchy plugin to see if it would work.
Not a single one of them
Oh,
successfully
that
stopped
looked
It
like
worked?
it worked. Boom.
There you go. God, hang on. I've seen that breakpoint hit 47 times. It doesn't mean it worked.
Yeah, just clap.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. That was educational.
We patch our software because we have bugs sometimes. Sometimes.
Sometimes.
That was by design.
Okay. See if we can smoothly transition back to the presenter laptop here.
5 seconds.
Look at my face. Look at my face. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So, waking up. Waking up. There we go. Okay. So what's coming soon? We have some other stuff that we didn't quite fit into 2.2 that we really wanted to fit into 2.2 that we hope to get out before 3.0. API client generation. So for people using NSWAG or AutoRest, or you think, I don't use either of those, but I've really always wanted to build my own client generation, we're going to build a better sort of integrated solution for doing that in ASP.NET Core or .NET projects in general.
Anyone done WCF?
Everyone's done WCF or ASMX in the day,
Add
right?
service reference. It's back.
Add
It's back.
web reference.
It's back.
Add service reference.
Yeah.
Just that it's not Wisdom.
Not the
and
bad
SOAP
part.
anymore.
This is the good version.
It's Swagger.
It's JSON.
It's JSON.
It's YAML, so it's better.
It's YAML? Okay.
Yeah.
So, there's a little bit of XML here. So you'll be able to very simply in your CS_proj file say, hey, add the package reference to whatever your code generator is. In this case, I'm using NSWAG. And then you'll be able to add this new thing to do a project-to-project reference. But rather than saying, although I'm going to get assemblies from here, I want to get services from here. And then it'll go off and actually generate you a .NET or a TypeScript client or whatever client your generator supports. So we're not actually building the generators because there are already capable generation systems. Microsoft has AutoRest, which comes from the Azure SDK team. The community has NSWAG, and there's probably others. We've been working with the NSWAG author. But we do want to build sort of the MS Build goop so that all of these things can plug into a nice user experience. And then eventually, in the next version of Visual Studio, we'll layer on a nice UI experience onto this as well so that you can add these references between projects easily. If you don't like project-to-project references, maybe you have a Swagger document that was given to you by the architect of your API, or you have a third-party API that you have to call, and they have a Swagger endpoint, right? You'll be able to point to that as well. Okay, all that stuff will work. And then lastly, we want to wrap all that stuff up and ship new templates for you that include all the stuff we've talked about. So we've got great support for Swashbuckle. So why don't we have a template that lets you add Swashbuckle so you don't have to find it? Or NSWAG. What about Poly that plugs into HTTP Client Factory to do failed request retries and circuit breakers and that type of stuff? Or BeatPulse that I showed. So we're going to look at building templates that include those components behind a nice experience and work with those authors to make sure you get a nice consistent experience when using them with ASP.NET Core. Now I do actually have a project that has API client generation in it. It's down here. So this is what it looks like. Okay. Zoom in a bit. That's out. So there's an example of one. This one is, I've got my server app. This is the web client. And it's using NSWAG to generate me a class called myClient. And then over in my startup, I'm adding that as a typed client to the HTTP Client Factory. So there's my myClient that was generated by the build system for me. And then in my code behind file for my page, I just inject my client and use it by calling the generated method, which calls my backend service. Okay? If you're doing distributed programming with HTTP APIs, this is an incredibly common pattern, but today a lot of people are hand-rolling this code because we don't have an integrated solution for doing it for you. All right, very quickly to finish off, I wanted to just remind folks about the .NET Core support lifecycle. I did mention that 2.1 is still our LTS release, so if you need that style of support and longevity, then you're probably best to stay on 2.1, but you will not get new features. You will get new SDKs though. It will be supported until at least August 2021, which is 3 years after it went LTS. They are supported by, via the Microsoft paid support channel. If you log a bug on GitHub and say, I want this fixed in an LTS release, and we've already fixed it in a current release, or we triage it into a current release, we'll ask you very politely to close the bug, or we'll close it on your behalf, and we'll send you through the Microsoft paid support channel. We'll even give you the link, so you can go and log your credit card and log your thing over there. The ASP.NET Core 2.1 on .NET Framework, however, is a special release, and that will be supported indefinitely. We announced that at the end of last year, so if you're going to use ASP.NET Core on .NET Framework and you need a longer time to migrate to .NET Core, that particular release is going to be around and supported as long as MVC 5, okay? And which is going to be supported pretty much forever, right? .NET Core 2.2 is the current release, so it will end of life 3 months after the GA of 3.0, because 3.0 is the next current release. That's how current releases work with .NET Core, all right? ASP.NET Core 3 finally will only run on .NET Core 3. We announced all of this months and months and months ago. It's not new. I just want to make sure that folks in the room are aware of that. So when we do 3.0 Preview 2 came out today, you try that out. There is no .NET Framework support for that. It is only on .NET Core 3. There is stuff coming in 3.0. I don't have any time. It's great. Go and read the blog post that Dan posted this morning about all the great stuff coming in 3.0. Thank you very much for listening about ASP.NET Core 2.2. You can hit me up on Twitter at Damian Edwards or David at David Fowler. And come and see our talk this afternoon about why your app won't scale. Thanks.